Good morning. Welcome back to day 2, our grand finale of Arrowheads to Aerospace, hosted by the Osceola Research Institute and a host of very generous sponsors that we indicate on the back page of the program. We're continuing now with our next speaker, Florida Gator, Dr. Bruce MacFadden, and I wanted to say one quick thing. I had the privilege of taking a class from Bruce when I was in graduate school at Florida, and I've spent way too much of my adult life getting educated. You can see how good I turned out at the University of Arizona, at the University of Florida, and at some afterwards at the University of Texas. And bar none, the finest in-class teacher I've had at any level, anywhere, is Bruce MacFadden. And I'm so proud to be able to introduce him and ask my friend Bruce to come up and talk to us about the Florida fossil horses.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. Very appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks, Andy, and thanks to Jim and the other folks that have put on this wonderful conference workshop. When Jim invited me to come back this year, I said, oh my gosh, I have to come back. I love being here. I love this community. I love the sense and spirit of this smaller and more intimate conference. When Jim said, I said, Jim, what do you want me to talk about? I'm not an archaeologist, and last time I talked about megafauna and that sort of archaeology. He goes, talk about horses. And I said, but I don't know a lot about archaeology and horses. He says, talk about the whole history of horses in Florida. I said, are you sure you want me to do that? And he goes, yeah, so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not just going to talk about horses and archaeology. All right. So I want to talk about, here's my outline for my talk. I want to talk about misconceptions about horses in North America among the general public, my background and my journey studying fossil horses, their relatives and how they were domesticated, and then I want to focus on Florida and how horses have been around in Florida for 30 million years and give you a sense of some of the changes in their evolutionary history as well as how they adapted to different sorts of climates and habitats. And then I'll introduce you to some zebras that used to live in Florida. Yes, zebras lived in Florida, as did horses during the Ice Age. And then talk a little bit about the intersection of archaeology and paleontology. And of course, I'm not an archaeologist, but I'll do my best to talk about the relevance of horses and extinctions and the interactions with humans during the Ice Age. Okay, so the general public believes or has the perceptions that horses were introduced to the Americas by the Spanish explorers about 500 years ago. Okay? So when I tell people that I study fossil horses that used to live in North America millions of years ago, they'll say stuff like, you can't do that, they weren't here. Well, they were here. Okay, and we have the evidence for that. Indeed, the fossil record indicates, and not just for all fossil horses, but the genus Equus, of course, which is the genus of the modern day or the extant horse. Equus originated in North America about 4.5 million years ago, and Equus became extinct in the Americas, not just North America, but it also got into South America about 10,000 years ago. So for archaeology, there is perhaps a 5,000 or maybe a little greater window of time after the last glacial, where humans and horses lived at the same time. And we're going to talk about that. Okay, so my background, I was a graduate student in New York City, and my major professor was a curator at the American Museum of Natural History, and the greatest collection, the largest collection of fossil horses in the world is at the American Museum of Natural History, where I grew up as a kid and then went back to as a graduate student. And my hero or my mentor was not actually my PhD advisor, although he was a great advisor, but the world-renowned paleontologist who studied fossil horses was a self-taught scientist, Morris Skinner. And Morris Skinner is in the right-hand side here, and this is a table up in the attic where the fossil horse collections were, and the horse skulls in the back represent horses species that lived 50 million years ago, and each one of these tape bands represents an interval of time moving forward in the geologic time scale to the horses that lived and ultimately became extinct in North America during the Ice Age. So if anybody wants to know what's the evidence, the real hard evidence for fossil horses in North America, they were displayed on this table. And this is how I learned about the evolutionary sequence from my mentor, Morris Skinner. My science journey has since I was a graduate student almost 50 years ago when I learned about fossil horses, and since that time, part of my specialty in terms of my development of my paleontological career has revolved around fossil horses. I wrote a book on fossil horses in 1992. I've designed museum exhibits and acted as a consultant for museums that want to display fossil horses like you see in the upper right-hand corner. And more recently, over the past decade, I've gotten really involved in disseminating my understanding and interest in fossil horses to public high school teachers throughout the United States, but particularly in Florida with a program called The Scientist in Every Florida School. Okay, why do I study fossil horses? Why would anyone choose to study fossil horses? If I was up here and told you that I study foraminifera or calicotheres, probably very few of you would know what those animals are, what those species are, and I would need 5 or 10 minutes to convince you that the rest of my lecture would be worthy of your attention. But if I say, hey, if I'm studying dinosaurs or megalodon or horses, they're charismatic animals that instantly capture the imagination of the public. So I'm very fortunate in that regard. The other thing about horses is that they're widely distributed in space and time over the past 55 million years. So there's lots of them to study. They evolve rapidly. So looking at principles or theories of evolution, this is a good group for an example. And therefore, they're a classic textbook and museum example of the theory of evolution or long-term evolution called macroevolution. This is a family tree on the left of horses arrayed through time, a complexly branching tree. This is a diagram which was published about 15 years ago, showing the unfolding of the evolutionary tree of horses through time. But the evidence for that is on that table that I showed you with Morris Skinner several slides back from North America. On the right-hand side are museum exhibits that display in simplified form the evolutionary history of horses. The problem with that is the array going from smaller horse on the right to medium-sized horse in the middle and large horse on the left suggests a linear arrangement from smaller to larger species of fossil horses, and that's an oversimplification based on the evolutionary tree and what we know from the evidence. And that's another one of the misconceptions that is perpetuated in some older museum exhibits. So in terms of the overall geologic timescale, we are looking at the history of horses, which came after the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, of course, were during the Mesozoic, but the horses started off in the Eocene about 55 million years ago, and they evolved in that branching phylogenetic pattern that I just showed you over the past 55 million years. And we're going to talk about the portion of the history of horses that are found in Florida over the past 30 million years. So I put a yellow arrow on the right to show you the interval of geologic time that's represented in Florida sediments, and hence the land masses that supported terrestrial ecosystems, including animals like extinct horses. So people ask me, what are horses related to? They are odd-toed hoofed mammals, also called ungulates, and a particular group, the scientific name of these ungulates is called Perissodactyla, which means one-toed or odd-toed ungulates. There are 3 modern families of these perissodactyls related to horses, including tapirs and rhinoceroses. Okay? But there are 2 extinct families of really interesting larger mammals larger perissodactyls related to horses, and these are called brontotheres, and those brontotheres, that skeleton in the lower left-hand corner is of a brontothere from the Badlands of Nebraska and South Dakota that are about 32 million years. And then there's this animal called a calicothere, which is the family Calicotheriidae there. And then we had these giant, among the largest land mammals that ever roamed the earth, are these giant rhinoceroses found in Asia called Indricotheres. So this is a sense of the diversity or diversification of the kind of perissodactyls that also include horses. The modern horse family is called Equidae, and it includes the modern genus Equus, which has, depending upon which method you use or which taxonomist you believe, anywhere from 8 to 10 species, including the domesticated horses and zebras and onagers and some of the other horse-like animals. All of these pictures here are different species within the genus Equus. 8 to 10 species. This is the veritable tip of the iceberg, because if you look at the fossil record of horses throughout the world, since their origins 55 million years ago, there are upwards of 200 extinct species. So more than a tenfold increase in the number of species that are extinct relative to those that are found today. Horses, we know based on archaeological investigations, particularly in areas like the grassland steppes of Mongolia and other areas of Eastern Asia, that horses were first domesticated by indigenous peoples in Eurasia, Eastern Asia, about 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. And there's evidence for this in zooarchaeological evidence for this, like you see in the excavation in the upper left-hand corner. In the lower left-hand corner is a Przewalski's horse, which is it's a modern-day horse, but it's presumed based on its shape and conformation to be very close to the ancestry of the horses that were domesticated by humans over the past 5,000 to 6,000 years. Okay, so now I want to continue the rest of my talk and focus on Florida and the fossil record of horses in Florida, and then conclude with the discussion of humans and horses in Florida. The earliest horses in Florida lived in ancient rainforests. We know that prior to about 30 million years ago, Florida was composed of very dense tropical rainforests. So far as we know, based on the evidence from the terrestrial mammal record, and these animals were these ancient horses called Mesohippus were based on their dentition and studies the chemistry of their teeth, stable isotopes of their teeth. They were forest-dwelling browser or leaf eaters. During the Eocene and the Oligocene. During the Miocene, the peninsula of Florida became larger, as you can see in green here. The landmass of the started to emerge and continued to develop along the panhandle as well as the peninsula. And in those ancient terrestrial ecosystems, we have a shift now from primarily forested-dominated ecosystems to a combination or a mix of forested and widespread grasslands during this time in the Miocene of Florida. And as a result of that, during this so-called grassland expansion in Florida, as elsewhere in the world, horses diversified into their numerous species at the base of that, the flowering radiation, so to speak, the branching radiation of the family tree of horses. Coming close to home, some of the best examples of the beginnings of this major radiation of grassland feeding species come from fossil horses that were collected from about 40 miles west of here in Gadsden County. There are some clay mines, also called Fuller's Earth Mines, and from these mines have been collected some of the best examples of the evolutionary transition of ancient horses that used to live throughout the world, including in Florida, that were initially adapted to feeding on grasses as opposed to soft leafy vegetation. Another famous locality of about the same age, about 18 million years ago, comes from a Thomas Farm fossil locality in rural Gilchrist County, where we get literally tens of thousands of individual bones of these horses. So these horses were very common very common in Florida, where we find them in ancient sinkholes and fuller's earth mines, etc. By about 5 million years ago, based on evidence from the phosphate mines in central Florida, in south of Lakeland, we have the evidence from these phosphate mines and also from a current dig that we're working at in Levy County called Montbrook. We're getting the direct ancestor of the modern day genus of horse Equus in Florida. Now it wasn't just found in Florida. This direct ancestor of Equus, a diorama of which is shown in the picture below, is an animal called Dinohippus, the large terrible horse, Mexicanus, because it was first found in northern Mexico at a locality called Yupomera. It's also found in some other sites in California and Nebraska. So we know that by about 5 million years ago, there were populations of the ancestral stock that gave rise to the modern day genus Equus, and these were found in many localities in North America. By the time we get into the Pleistocene, the ice ages, the beginnings of which occurred during the Pliocene into the Pleistocene, we have literally hundreds of fossil localities in Florida that preserve records of the megafauna, and this megafauna includes fossil Equus. Each one of the green dots in the slide on the left is a fossil locality that's been registered in our digital database of collections at the University of Florida in the Vertebrate Paleontology Division. And these come from localities that, again, have prolific fossils, like you can see in the upper right-hand corner, where a former graduate student and collections manager, Gary Morgan here, they're collecting about 1.5 million-year-old fossil horses of Equus from a locality called the Lycee Shell Pit. Artists' reconstruction of what Florida megafauna looked like at this time, these reconstructions are depicted, as you can see, for example, in the lower right-hand corner. And what you see in the foreground is an animal, and the artist is hedging their bets because it looks like it's a zebra, or a zebra like at least a partial zebra. So we know that during the Ice Age in Florida, horses had several different kinds that are the precursors of the modern day horse family. We had horses that looked more like domesticated or wild horses living in Florida. But we also have animals based on the shape of their teeth and some structures of the skull that indicate that the ancestors of zebras did not first occur in Africa. They first occurred in North America in places like Florida, and then they dispersed westward across the isthmus, the Siberian Peninsula during times of lowered sea level. Okay, so this all brings me to the last part of my talk, and that is the extinction. So during the Ice Ages, during the Pleistocene, we've just learned that fossil Equus was very plentiful in Florida. It also was very plentiful throughout in all of North America. The map in the upper part of this slide, each one of those orange dots indicates a locality in a global database of fossils called GBIF or iDigBio, either one, where we have examples or evidence of fossil horses that lived during the Pleistocene in these localities. The reason there's a large orange circle in Florida is that there's so many localities in Florida. It's swamps. Basically, this is the richest area, the treasure trove of fossil Equus in all of North America. And Equus was part of the megafauna, and I talked about the megafaunal extinctions in Florida at the last conference that I participated in here. But I want to focus in on there. If you look, let's see. If you look right here, within this cast of characters of about 40 different megafaunal species that lived in the ice ages of Florida and elsewhere. We have horses like you see here. So the big question that confronts not just paleontologists but archaeologists and climate scientists, what happened to the megafauna at the end of the Pleistocene? We know that between the last glacial and about 10,000 years ago, we might ask the question, did native peoples hunt or otherwise interact with late Pleistocene horses throughout North America? That's a large question, okay? And we know that there's some new thinking about the age of human. The footprints, for example, in New Mexico are fascinating. If you haven't read about them, there's some convincing evidence that humans were walking on ancient deserts of New Mexico 25,000? 23? Much earlier than what we think was the first occurrence of humans in the southeast about 15,000 years ago. Now I'm treading on archaeology territory, so I'm going to be very careful about what I say. So the other question is, when did humans and horses interact throughout North America? But the other one is, did humans and horses coexist in the late Pleistocene of Florida? What we know, and I've actually studied the chemistry of the bones from the it used to be called the Vero Man site back 100 years ago, and it was a famous fossil site. Many of you have probably heard of the Vero archaeological site because it has humans remain, presumably or apparently intermixed within ancient megafauna. What we know, based on the hard evidence, is that there are human remains in about 50 specimens, not necessarily 50 individuals, Andy, of equus at the Vero site, but there are 50 cataloged specimens in our collections of horses. So horses and humans are both found at the Vero site. The radiocarbon date of soils at Vero is between about 19 and 9 million years ago, within that window that I'm talking about where we potentially could have some interactions. And Andy, you've shared with me that there's an armadillo, there's a giant armadillo, that's a Homzina, right, Andy? That's been dated about 13,000 calendar years BP, before present. So these animals were living together with humans, but there's no evidence at Vero, so far as I know, of actual, the humans and the horses, the humans worked artifacts that would indicate that the humans had directly interacted with the horses. Many of you know Barbara Purdy, a dear friend of mine, and about 15 years ago I published a paper on using a new technique called rare earth element analysis. It's very much like the fluorine dating technique that they used to solve the Piltdown fraud back in the 1950s. It basically is dependent upon the uptake of various elements in the groundwater, and if something's in the groundwater for a much longer period of time, meaning it's older, it's going to have higher concentrations. So Barbara read one of my articles about migration patterns of giant birds in the southeast United States, and she said, that's really fascinating, we got to test that on Vero. And she kept on me, and ultimately what we did is we tested if you look at this stratigraphic section, in Unit 2, which is the middle one, you have some letters and some numbers. The letters are human artifacts, human skeletal remains, not artifacts, human skeletal remains, and the numbers are megafauna. So we know that megafauna and human skeletal remains of we know that megafauna and human skeletal remains are found in the same stratigraphic section. But the question is, were the humans burials, or were they around during the late Pleistocene? So Barbara and I worked with other people in this paper that was published in the Journal of Paleontology, and we determined that the rate of rare earth element uptake, like the fluoride dating or the fluorine dating of Piltdown, indicated that the human skeletal remains and the megafaunal remains in Unit 2 are of the same age. They're roughly contemporaneous is what I'm trying to say. So we know that humans and megafauna coexisted. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they interacted. So I make the distinction between if we establish that in Vero that humans and megafauna coexisted because they're found at the same locality and lived at the same time, for example, in Unit 2. But it's my understanding, I hope I'm correct, that there's no evidence of worked bones at Vero. Is that correct, Andy?
Not at Vero.
Not at Vero, thank you. And that's all I want to talk about because that's all we worked on. There is no evidence that humans interacted directly with megafauna such as horses. They coexisted, but they did not necessarily interact. All right. So I wanted to know what is it. I asked Andy in September, I said, Andy, I'm giving this talk, I know nothing about archaeology or very little about archaeology. What do we know about, is there any evidence of the interaction between humans and horses during the late Pleistocene in Florida? There's no evidence at Vero, so what evidence is there? And here are 4 or 5 different examples of actual physical objects of horse bones that were worked by humans. So what that indicates is that humans were interacting with horses at these localities, and that's very interesting. So to answer the question about how and when did horses interact with humans in Florida, what we can say is that based on evidence from localities like Vero, horses and humans lived in Florida for at least 5,000 years, let's say, together until the horses became extinct in this area, so far as we can tell, about 10,000 years ago. And we have evidence that they just didn't live alongside one another, but humans worked fossil horse bones. Very interesting. Okay, so that summarizes my knowledge of the interaction between horses and humans in the late Pleistocene of Florida. But I want to talk with you, I want to end with a really interesting recent study that was published in Science magazine. There's this idea, okay, most people feel that horses were introduced, or shall we say reintroduced, based on what we know, during historic times by the Spanish, okay, about 500 more or less years ago. But they were extinct. The dogma, or the prevailing hypothesis, is that between about 10,000 years ago and 500 years ago, there were no horses in North America. Okay? But there's this, over the past couple of decades, there's been this alternate hypothesis that's been advanced that some of the wild horses, like the mustangs and the herds of horses in places like the Great Basin of Nevada and the southwestern United States, are Pleistocene holdovers, and that horses never really became fully extinct at the end of the Pleistocene, but they hung out in geographically restricted or isolated areas, and the herds that we find today in these areas are Pleistocene relics or holdovers. Okay? So a really fascinating study that was published just in March asked the question, are the kinds of horses that have been in association with historic or prehistoric humans throughout North America, were those horses holdovers from the late Pleistocene? Or were those horses brought in by the Spanish as domesticates and then were traded with the indigenous peoples in North America? So that sets up a very interesting hypothesis about which is correct to test. And what's been found is that based on genomic studies, so that's the studies of the genetics of ancient bones and modern horse populations that indigenous people have, that there is absolutely no evidence of late Pleistocene genetics, or blood, so to speak, in the horses that are here today, and that all the horses that were brought in as domesticates by the Spanish about 500 years ago were the ones that were I don't want to use the word domesticated by Native Americans, because This article is absolutely fascinating because half the authors are Native American. And they talk about the spiritual view of horses in their culture, and they don't feel as humans that they've actually domesticated the horses. They feel that the horses that they have the privilege of interacting with are part of the landscape. So to me, this particular article, which if you're interested you ought to read, and I thought it was very relevant for this talk because it's current knowledge, is that it debunks the idea of these late Pleistocene holdovers in these isolated herds that include Mustangs of Great Basin. That the Native Americans, the indigenous peoples, did not interact with, or we would say domesticate, these late Pleistocene holdovers. Sure, they did not. They took the horses that were brought in during colonization and were rapidly traded or disseminated to the various indigenous peoples. That was the stock brought in, and the idea of late Pleistocene holdovers no longer can be supported based on what we know from modern evidence. Okay, so my take-home message to wrap up today is that horses in North America were native to this continent. There's a 30 million year fossil record in Florida. Horses and humans lived at the same time after the last glacial. In some places they coexisted with humans. In other places they were potentially hunted by humans. Horses became extinct throughout the Americas 10,000 years ago. There is no evidence for late Pleistocene holdovers hanging on to the present day. And we know that horses have been associated with indigenous peoples for about 6 centuries. Thank you.